So, as we all know, the history of gaming is littered with cult classics, brilliant diamonds left to shine in the darkness by the general public. But you know what? This list is not about them. Instead, we're taking a look at some of gaming's most notorious overachievers, towering edifices of mediocrity whose staggering commercial success belied the deficiencies of their design. Translation, they kinda sucked. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are video games that sold millions despite being terrible. Wii Music. The mid to late noughties was a golden period for rhythm games. The likes of Guitar Hero and Rock Band saw gamers across the world strutting their stuff and living out their rock star fantasies in the comfort of their living rooms. Naturally, Nintendo wanted to get in on the action in their own idiosyncratic way. Unfortunately, this particular brand of idiosyncratic genius was less the Beatles and more John and Yoko. Wii Music suffered from two big problems. One was its inescapable air of cheapness, from the low-tech graphics to the public domain songs that made up the majority of its tracklist, and the other was total lack of immersion. Guitar Hero and its ilk succeeded because playing on their peripherals created a genuine sense of engagement with the music. Wii Music, on the other hand, simply asked players to half-heartedly swing their Wii controller around in a vague approximation of whichever instrument you were tasked with playing. This had all of the immersion of waving a baguette at home and pretending you were conducting the London Symphony Orchestra, with the downside being that you couldn't eat the Wiimote afterwards. Shadow the Hedgehog. There is no greater indicator of emo's power in the mid-noughties than the fact that Shadow the Hedgehog managed to sell millions of copies. Now, Shadow the Hedgehog may not be the worst Sonic game ever made. The glitch-filled bestiality promoting Sonic 06 definitely holds that dubious distinction, but it's definitely located somewhere near the bottom of the Sonic barrel. As well as its posturing, try-too-hard attitude, Shadow suffers from the same bugbears that affect pretty much all of the worst Sonic games, chiefly a camera that actively avoids showing you important information and overly sensitive controls making the protagonist move like an absolute pinball. Unfortunately, Shadow also adds its own bitter twist to the toxic Sonic formula, and that is guns. The gunplay in Shadow really is utterly hopeless, as the lock-on constantly fails to distinguish between friend and foe, and the aforementioned camera problems see the player having to constantly fire at off-screen targets. It says something that Shadow the Hedgehog never received a sequel despite selling millions. Sega knew that they got lucky with this Hedgehog's first and so far last game and wisely quit while they were ahead. Aliens Colonial Marines. Yeah, I mean, just look at this footage. It tells you everything that you need to know about the state that Aliens Colonial Marines launched in. The millions of people who had the misfortune to purchase this game may have expected a nerve-shredding Aliens experience, but what they got were interstellar improv routines. The AI of the eponymous xenomorphs were utterly broken, leading to scenes like the ones you're seeing here. Incredibly, the xenomorphs' wonky AI was later discovered to be the result of a single typo in the game's code, with a renegade A completely breaking Colonial Marines' artificial intelligence systems. 6 years and millions of dollars in development costs flushed down the drain because of a random spell check error. Now that was a waste of resources that even Wayland Yutani would balk at. Hey You Pikachu. I mean, how far can you stretch the definition of game here? It's a question that Nintendo has often asked itself to varying degrees of success. Sometimes it leads to greatness, like the beguiling charms of Animal Crossing, and other times, well, it winds up with players yelling futile commands at a yellow rat determined to ignore them. Hey You Pikachu was a voice recognition game for the N64 that successfully rode the Pokémon hype train to the tune of around 2 million sales, which is pretty impressive for an $80 game that contained maybe 2 hours of content. Hey You Pikachu tasked players with instructing Pikachu to complete simple puzzles through the microphone that came bundled with the game, which led to the vastly inflated price tag. Unfortunately, Pikachu's limited vocabulary, meaning that he could only recognize around 200 words, and the mic's limitations itself meant that the yellow mascot was as likely to zap you with a thunderbolt as he was to follow your commands. Combined with the game's lack of content, Hey You Pikachu was an overpriced novelty that signaled the death knell for Nintendo's foray into voice recognition gaming. Homefront. A blatant attempt at jumping on the Call of Duty bandwagon, Homefront didn't just miss the mark, it stumbled, fell in front of the wagon and got trampled to death by the horses, who then used its remains as a toilet. Homefront makes the classic mistake of any pale imitation in that it chooses the wrong things to copy from its inspiration. In this case, it means that Homefront is overtly scripted to the point that you feel like the designers are only begrudgingly letting you play it. Every single action is narrated out loud for you by your squad of teammates, while the camera points you you exactly where you need to go, and a button prompt details exactly what you have to do. It's like the developers just don't trust you and feel the need to force you into having the exact experience that they envisioned. And the nadir comes when Homefront, and yes, this actually happens, demands that you press X to jump into a mass grave. It's exactly as crass, tone-deaf, and moronic as it sounds. And to add insult to the intelligence of the player, the only QTE that this game needed was press X to get your refund. Call of Duty Ghosts. And speaking of Call of Duty, here's the point where the franchise just went off the rails. A jumbled mess of a game, COD Ghosts had no idea what it wanted to be. The game's marketing promised a campaign focused on guerrilla warfare and stealth, hence the ghosts of the title, as you sneaked around America to thwart the bad guys du jour. So naturally, the first mission ends with more explosions than a Michael Bay movie, and the finale involves flying into outer space and firing a sci-fi doomsday weapon. What? Ghosts just felt like a game made in a hurry, a hodgepodge of different half-baked ideas and themes just all thrown together in the hopes that something would stick. Take Extinction as an example, a twist on the traditional COD Zombies mode. Extinction replaced the undead with extraterrestrials for no adequate reason. It was a change for the sake of change, and COD quickly went back to the zombies in all future installments, which rather sums up Ghost's lack of impact on the franchise. Although it sold tens of millions and ended on a massive cliffhanger, COD's publishers have made no sign that Ghost 2 will ever be forthcoming. Resident Evil 6. And speaking of franchise low points, here's Resident Evil 6. Thinking about it, Resident Evil 6 and COD Ghosts actually have a lot in common. They're both regarded as one of the worst games in their series, they both suffer from overstuffed, messy campaigns, and they both somehow sold in the tens of millions. Playing Resident Evil 6, the first thing that strikes you is the weightlessness of the combat. Enemies take far too many bullets to go down, and there's no sense of impact in any of your weapons. Every battle feels like a childhood play fight with that one friend who refused to admit that they were dead, usually through some sort of force field bullshit. The second thing that you'll notice is that Resident Evil 6 would have benefited enormously from, well, just being cut in half. The 4-campaign single player is easily 2 campaigns too long, and Chris and Jake's stories contain the worst gameplay in Resident Evil history. Chris's story is a dull slog, and Jake's is so badly designed it will actively annoy you. A midlife crisis in video game form, Resident Evil 6 saw Capcom embarrass itself trying to ape the trends of the time. It didn't work, and Capcom thankfully took the series back to its roots for the rather stellar Resident Evil 7. Kinect Adventures. In video games, as is the case in so much of life, timing is everything. For a golden minute, Microsoft's Kinect looked like it was going to be the next big thing in gaming, a body tracking device that promised a shining future of controller-free gaming. But it turned out to be a buggy, barely responsive novelty item that was quickly discarded when the depths of its flaws became apparent. Unfortunately, millions of people fell for the hype, resulting in the woeful Kinect Adventures making its way onto this list. A pack-in game bundled with the Kinect itself, Kinect Adventures was clearly meant to be seen as the next Wii Sports, a minigame compilation designed to show off the possibilities of the new hardware. Unfortunately, whatever magic pixie dust Nintendo used on the Wii Sports title was clearly in short supply with this one. Like the aforementioned Hey You Pikachu, Kinect Adventures is less a game and more of a showcase for a semi-functioning piece of tech. 2 hours of limb flailing let most gamers see everything this title had to offer, at which point the game itself began gathering dust alongside the Kinect. Grand Theft Auto: The Trilogy. So in 2020, we saw CD Projekt Red's infamous RPG, aka Cyberpunk 2077, become the biggest piñata of the video games industry. And November 2021 saw gaming outlets far and wide absolutely batter Take-Two's disastrous revival of the PS2-era Grand Theft Autos. And with good reason. Far from being the definitive additions promised in the title, the remasters made each game actively worse. Characters were given hideously ugly redesigns, iconic songs from the soundtracks were cut for licensing reasons, and the game's remastered weather effects were legitimately worse than the 2004 originals. And that's not even mentioning the bizarre glitches or the genuinely insulting Switch port. And yet, despite all of that, Take-Two reported that the remasters exceeded sales projections, with up to 10 million copies reportedly having been sold. Now, the GTA games themselves have always held a dim view on humanity, and if that many people willfully parted money for this dumpster fire of a collection, then you can see why. FIFA Legacy Editions. So here's a true story. If you look up FIFA 22 on Nintendo eShop, there is only one picture available in the preview gallery, which begs the question, what are EA trying to hide? Is it the mannequin-like character models, the lack of modes, or the fact that EA have been releasing the exact same game for 5 years? And that's not hyperbole, by the way. The FIFA Legacy Editions use the same engine that powered FIFA 2017, with only the team rosters and outfits changing every year. While other consoles get engine updates and new modes every year, Switch players players get a reskinned version of a 5-year-old game. The FIFA Legacy Editions are endemic of everything wrong with the games industry, a cynical, effort-free cash grab that nevertheless makes millions every year. The only way that the Legacy Editions could be more insulting is if EA started bundling them with NFTs showing their shareholders laughing at you all the way to the bank.
GoldenEye Rogue Agent. GoldenEye Rogue Agent just about manages to scrape into this list with 1 million copies sold across all formats, which is appropriate because just scraping by seems to have been the overriding ethos behind its creation. From 1999 to 2005, EA released one James Bond game a year. Given that rate of production, it was inevitable quality control would drop at some point, and with Rogue Agent it plummeted like Sean Bean at the end of the movie this game takes its title from. From the decision to name it after the most beloved 007 game of all time to the bland identikit levels populated by brain-dead henchmen, Rogue Agent bears all the hallmarks of a game churned out to make a quick profit. EA's tenure with the Bond franchise did occasionally lead to magic. Everything or Nothing is still an absolute joy to blast through, but there's no doubt that the company's decision to milk the 007 brand produced as much trash as treasure, with Rogue Agent sitting squarely at the top of the landfill. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Sonic 06 is the one where Sonic's corpse is brought back to life after being kissed by a human princess. Right, entry over, moving on. Okay, fine, let's do it properly. In a franchise that has seen its fair share of clunkers in the last 18 years, Sonic and the Black Knight, Sonic Forces, Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric, it's almost impressive that the 2006 entry is still seen as the absolute nadir of the series. Needless to say, that reputation is fully deserved, as Sonic 2006 is utterly abysmal at everything it attempts. The storyline is overstuffed, overwrought nonsense involving gods, time travel and interspecies necrophilia. The camera and glitchy controls actively conspire to send you falling to your doom at least once a level, and loading screens are absurdly prolific and ridiculously long. Incredibly, Sonic 2006 came out hot on the heels of the equally dreadful Shadow the Hedgehog, which was released only a year prior. Not many series could survive a devastating 1-2 punch to their reputation. Maybe that princess kiss really was magic. Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness. Poor core design. While Sonic Team survived producing disaster after disaster, one bad game was all it took for Tomb Raider's original developers to collapse like a poorly built house of cards. To be fair to Core, they realised that the Tomb Raider formula had become increasingly stale over the past 5 entries, and so Angel of Darkness was meant to be a new direction for the franchise as a whole, but said new direction came perilously close to turning the franchise away from the promised land and straight to the island of irrelevancy. Putting it kindly, Angel of Darkness was a brave failure. None of the new features worked, the RPG mechanics were half-baked, the controls were an unsatisfying halfway house between the D-pad focused classic games and modern analog stick controls, and the stealth mechanics would have been risible in the early 90s, never mind 2003. Despite selling just under 3 million copies, Angel of Darkness's critical pasting meant that the franchise was passed on to Crystal Dynamics, who provided some impressive course correction with their own highly underrated Tomb Raider trilogy. Core Design, meanwhile, were quietly shuttered a few years later. Medal of Honor Warfighter. EA's series of World War II focused FPS games were hugely popular in the early noughties, with Frontline and Rising Sun combining to sell upwards of 15 million units. Unfortunately, in 2007, a Call of Duty-shaped bomb fell from the sky and obliterated gamers' interest in EA's franchise. EA fought back with 2010's Medal of Honor, a modern warfare-based reboot that shamelessly pilfered from Activision's juggernaut franchise. Medal of Honor's copying from Call of Duty's Homework may have been brazen, but it clearly worked, as the reboot sold around 5 million copies. Unfortunately, EA failed to make lightning strike twice with the follow-up. Warfighter was a rushed mess of a game. The shooting felt weak and unsatisfying, the campaign was comfortably the worst in franchise history, and the game released with a boatload of technical glitches, such as enemies and allies alike flickering in and out of sight like predators with wonky camouflage. Despite this, Warfighter still managed to sell 3 million copies across all formats. Unfortunately for it and the series at large, Call of Duty Black Ops 2 sold 31 million copies. EA saw the writing on the wall and admitted defeat, quietly closing the door on what had once been one of their biggest moneymakers. WWE 2K15. No, we're not including 2K20, and there's a very good reason for that. As while the game will forever be remembered as one of the biggest disappointments in gaming history, its publishers have tactily acknowledged that fact by refusing to release sales data for it. They have, however, released sales for WWE 2K15, which means we know that 3 30 million WWE fans experienced one of the biggest backward steps in franchise history. After the truly excellent 2K14, expectations were high for what was being billed as the first truly next-gen entry in the WWE 2K series. Sadly, all that effort was spent on making sure the wrestlers' baby oil glistened just right meant that the work in a lot of other areas was left undone. A staggering amount of content from the previous year's entry was left on the cutting room floor. The roster size had shrunk alarmingly from 83 wrestlers to 60. Entire match types went missing, custom-made stories were out, and inexplicably you couldn't create female wrestlers anymore, meaning you were stuck with the whopping 8 female talents that released on disc. Anthem. This one takes a bit of research because EA have never officially revealed Anthem's sales data, but thanks to the fine folks at Super Data Research, it's public knowledge that Anthem made $100 million in digital revenue in its launch month, only 3.5 million of which came from in-game purchases. As such, you can reasonably intuit that Anthem sold well over 1 million copies. Furthermore, by actually playing it, you can also ascertain that Anthem was lucky to sell over 10,000 copies, let alone 1 million. For a game about bombing around lush sci-fi vistas in Iron Man-style power armor, Anthem is unspeakably dull. Once you've spent the dozen or so hours it takes to polish off the campaign, all you're left with is a ceaseless, joyless grind of bashing overly familiar enemies in increasingly boring locations. The fact that you can apply the previous sentence to any number of live service failures over the years, such as Avengers, Babylon's Fall, Godfall, shows why Anthem failed. It was yet another mediocre entry in an overstuffed market, and soon found itself occupying one more casket in an increasingly packed graveyard. Need for Speed Payback. Goodness me, EA have shown up rather a lot on this list, haven't they? It's equal parts disturbing and impressive that one company can produce so much crap while raking in so much money. The fourth and final EA game on this list, Need for Speed Payback, represents an interesting contrast to Medal of Honor Warfighter. Like Warfighter, Payback represents the absolute worst of its respective franchise. Like Warfighter, Payback sold upwards of 3 million copies. Unlike Warfighter, Payback didn't represent the end of its franchise, as Need for Speed games are still going strong to this day, with last year's Need for Speed Unbound being something of a series highlight. When it's on form, it's arguably the greatest arcade racing series in the world, and it didn't deserve to go under because of one bad game. Having said that, Payback was a really bad game. Payback unsuccessfully married the series' high-octane racing with one of the blandest open worlds ever created, and further self-sabotaged with the introduction of insidious microtransactions. Both additions, somewhat ironically, slowed the game's pacing to a crawl and ensured that Payback was best left in the franchise's rear-view mirror. Pac-Man for Atari 2600. In the olden days, reviewers used the phrase arcade perfect to describe a home console game that almost perfectly replicated its arcade version. Pac-Man on the Atari was very much the opposite end of that scale. Just looking at it tells you what's wrong automatically. Even non-gamers have a pretty good idea of what Pac-Man is supposed to look like. It's pretty much the "we have Pac-Man at home" meme, and unsurprisingly, it plays as terribly as it looks. Such was the Atari version of Pac-Man's all-encompassing ineptitude that it, along with the legendarily terrible licensed E.T. game, is often blamed for the video game market's infamous crash in 1983. Over 8 million people bought Pac-Man on the Atari, and it's all too easy to imagine every one of those 8 million thinking, well, I'm not making that mistake again, before swearing off video games for good and finding something else to do with their time. Some games may have gotten their franchise cancelled, but Pac-Man is one of very few that almost caused the death of the entire industry in North America. We Play. Sometime with a product, it's not about what you do, but how you market it. And in the case of We Play, it was less how you market it and more what you bundle it with. We Play sold close to a whopping 30 million units, not because of its quality, but because it came bundled with the Wiimote, the controller for Nintendo's hugely successful Wii console. Given that the Wii was at its best when you had as many friends and family members together as possible all swinging Wiimotes, you can see why We Play sold so well. A free game to go with a much needed extra controller, how bad could it be? Sadly and predictably, the answer to that question is very bad indeed. We Play wound up being a total waste of both the plastic it was printed on and of the 5 minutes Nintendo apparently spent developing it. A collection of half-baked minigames that would be shamed by even the most basic free App Store download, We Play unfortunately acted as a precursor to the tidal wave of shovelware that would eventually consume the Wii. And to be fair, on that front, Nintendo had only themselves to blame. If one of their own games was a half-baked mess like We Play, they were hardly in a position to complain when other developers delivered titles of similar quality. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. I personally had a good time with Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, and it may be the least objectively terrible game on this list, but I wouldn't put that quote on the box. Regardless of the core gameplay loop. Nintendo shouldn't have released these games in the condition they were in at launch, as it buried any other conversation about the game. 22 million people and counting picked up the latest monster collecting adventure and booted up the game to find a level of polish that didn't reflect Pokemon's standing as one of the biggest media franchises in the world. Fans forgave Pokemon Legends Arceus for its shaky performance because it tried something new with the Pokemon formula, but Scarlet and Violet, both mainline entries in the franchise, should never have been allowed to tarnish the brand to the extent that they did upon their release. Such is the power of Pokemon that tens of millions of gamers have willingly parted with their cash to spend more time in its one-of-a-kind world, even when said world has a habit of popping in and out of existence or slowing down to a crawl at a moment's notice. There are a good number of things Nintendo and Game Freak can do to fix the Pokemon franchise, and in fact we put them all into a handy video for you. Click this to stay with us here at What Culture Gaming, otherwise leave a comment down below about more bad video games that sold really well, like this video. Subscribe, head over to whatculture.com for more content every day. I've been Si for What Culture, and have a good week.